I have told this story only once before to the Duke himself on the night before his wedding, and even then he stopped me halfway through and said very quietly that he already knew every word of it. He had been there, after all. He had lived it. But he let me finish because he said the pleasure of a story told by a friend who loves you is not the information. It is the witness. My name is Gareth Halford. I have been Alaric Cairnholt's closest friend since we were 17 and studying the same useless Latin under the same unwilling tutor. I have been beside him in the good years and the black ones. I was there the morning he buried his first wife, and I was there a year after, when he finally emerged from his study and said he thought he might eat dinner again, and I was beside him on the northern road the afternoon his horse threw him into the ditch, and I was standing in the lane when he came back to the Calloway farm 6 weeks later to ask for Edith's hand. I saw all of it. What I want to tell you is how a man who had spent 40 years learning not to want anything came undone in 4 days at a farmhouse table, and why he came back, and what she said when he did. The rain had been falling since midday, the kind of flat, determined northern rain that doesn't bother with drama. It simply descends and stays. We were riding back from a surveying visit to the Harwick timber leases, just the two of us, no servants, no outriders. Alaric had insisted on it. He did that sometimes, stripped the machinery of the dukedom entirely away and rode out as a plain man. I had long since learned to read it as a sign that the machinery was grinding him down. He had been silent all morning. Not the comfortable silence of a man at ease, but the held silence of a man keeping himself very still against something he could not name. The road dipped toward a stone bridge, and a herd of loose sheep came scattering around the corner from nowhere, as sheep do, with that specific cheerful idiocy that has ended more rides than bad weather. Alaric's gray gelding shied sideways, hit the wet verge, and went down. I had my own horse under control by the time I wheeled back, but Alaric was already in the ditch, the gelding scrambling upright without him, unhurt and immediately unrepentant. I was off my horse in a moment. He was conscious. I could hear him, but not moving, one hand pressed hard to his thigh, his face set in that particular expression that means the Duke of Cairnholt is in considerable pain and absolutely refuses to say so. "Your leg," I said. "Observant," he said through his teeth. "It was not broken. We established that between us with the grim mutual efficiency you develop when you have been friends long enough to have managed each other's injuries more than once. But the muscle was badly torn and he could not put weight on it, and the nearest town was 8 miles back on a worsening road, and the rain was not letting up. I had just begun to calculate our options, send me ahead for a cart, try to get him onto my horse, shelter under the bridge, when I heard the gate. She came through it from the field side, a young woman in a plain brown work dress, an oilskin thrown over her shoulders against the rain, her hair pinned up and already half escaped from the pins. She was carrying a wooden pail that she had clearly set down the instant she saw us, and she was moving with the steady, purposeful speed of someone who has dealt with emergencies before and knows that urgency matters more than composure. "Is he badly hurt?" she asked me, the one of us who was upright, which I thought was sensible. "Not broken," I said, "but he can't ride." She crouched beside Alaric in the mud without hesitation, without any expression of reluctance or distaste, as though mud were simply a condition of the world and not worth remarking on. She pressed 2 careful fingers along the line of his thigh, watching his face as she did it. He said nothing. She looked at the leg, and then at his face, and then she said, "Can you stand with help?" "Yes," he said. "Then we'll get you to the house. It's a 1/4 mile across the field. Will your friend manage the horses?" She was not asking his permission. She was simply organizing the situation as it presented itself, allocating resources, assigning tasks. I saw Alaric register this, a small shift behind his eyes, something that might have been attention where there had been pain and pride and the effort of not showing either. He said, "Yes, thank you." Her name, we learned as she walked beside him with his arm across her shoulders and her shoulder firmly under his weight, was Edith Calloway. Her father's farm was the property behind the gate, a working farm, modest and well-kept, sheep and a kitchen garden, and a stand of old apple trees going gray and bare in the autumn cold. Her father, Thomas Calloway, met us at the farmhouse door with a lantern and the easy, unsurprised calm of a man who has seen worse arrive on his doorstep and survived it. He took Alaric's other side without a word, not of welcome or complaint or surprise, and together the 3 of them brought him inside. Alaric had told her his name was Ash. He told me later, quietly, that he had given that name without thinking. It was the name he sometimes used when he rode out without his title, a habit from years back that he had never quite abandoned, and that in the moment, with the mud and the pain and the rain and the particular vertigo of lying in a ditch on the northern road, it had simply come out. He had not decided to deceive her, but he had not corrected it either. And so the Duke of Cairnholt was installed in the Calloway's spare room, on a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt of considerable age and evident industry, with his leg wrapped in clean linen and a fire built up in the small grate, while Edith Calloway brought him a bowl of broth, plain earthenware, no pretension to it, and asked, without ceremony, whether he took salt. I slept in the hayloft, which was dry and warm and not at all unpleasant. I lay in the dark listening to the rain on the roof, and I thought about the look on Alaric Cairnholt's face as Edith had crouched in the mud beside him. I had known that man for 23 years. I knew what his face looked like when he was being flattered, when he was being managed, when he was being petitioned, when people were performing things at him in hope of a return. I had never seen his face look quite the way it had looked in that ditch, like something that had been holding a shape for a long time and had, for just a moment, been allowed to be something else. I thought, this will be interesting. The next morning was clear and pale. The leg was worse, as injured muscles always are on the second day when the first shock has worn off and the damage has had time to announce itself properly. Edith came in at first light with more broth and a poultice she had made from dried herbs, something her mother's recipe, she said, without elaboration. It smelled of something medicinal and faintly sharp, and probably worked. She unwrapped his leg, looked at it with the same calm attention she brought to everything, rewrapped it with the poultice in place, and then stood and said with perfect composure that he would not be riding for at least 3 days and probably 4. Alaric started to object. She looked at him, not a harsh look, not cold. Simply the look of a woman who has spent 7 years running a household, managing a farm, nursing a father through 2 hard winters, and knows what an injured leg looks like and what happens to it when the man attached to it does not listen. The particular patience of someone who has no time for pride. She said, the muscle needs to hold still. If you ride on it now, you'll do permanent damage, and you'll do it quietly, and you won't know until it's too late to fix. I expect you know what you're doing in most situations, Mr. Ashe. This one is mine. There was a silence. All right, said the Duke of Cairnholt. I was standing in the doorway, and I nearly walked into the frame. He stayed 4 days. The leg improved steadily, as legs do when the person attached to them is persuaded to treat them with the seriousness they deserve. I spent those 4 days making myself useful around the farm, mending a section of fence that had come down in the rain, carrying feed to the sheep on the upper field, helping Thomas stack firewood against the coming cold. Thomas Calloway was a quiet man, economical with speech in the way men sometimes are who live largely alone with the weather, but he expressed approval through action, and I noticed him twice stop to point out something that needed doing before I got to it myself, which I took as a form of acceptance. I checked in on Alaric each morning and evening. What I saw, across those 4 days, was a man slowly remembering something he had forgotten he knew. Edith Calloway was not deferential. That was the first thing, and it struck me every time I observed it, because nearly everyone in Alaric's world was deferential to him. By training, by calculation, by the simple instinct of people who have learned that a duke's good opinion is a resource worth cultivating. He had long since stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the furniture in a room you have always lived in. Edith was not rude. She was warm, capable, and entirely decent. But she simply treated him as a person who was currently injured and needed looking after, and when he offered opinions she found unpersuasive, she said so, and she said why. On the second afternoon they had a conversation about the Harwick Road, whether the county ought to repair the bridge before winter came in earnest. Alaric had opinions about infrastructure and about the county's budget priorities and about the way these decisions were typically made. So did she. She had grown up on that road. She had driven a cart over that bridge in the autumn floods and lost a wheel to the damaged stone. She knew the names of 3 other families who had lost worse. She laid out the case with a directness and a grasp of the particulars that I could see surprised him. Not the surprise of a man encountering intelligence where he hadn't expected it, but the surprise of a man accustomed to being agreed with encountering someone who simply hadn't got the habit. He pushed back, she held her ground. He offered a counter-argument, she dismantled it and offered her own. By the end of the exchange, he was almost smiling. Not the controlled, courteous smile I had seen him deploy at 100 dinners and 100 county meetings, but something more unguarded, closer to the surface. "You've thought about this a good deal," he said. "It's my road," she said simply and went back to her mending. On the third day she sat with him through the long afternoon while Thomas was out with the sheep. She was mending, a shirt of her father's, a needle moving neatly through worn linen, and Alaric lay back against the pillows and was pretending to rest and actually watching her. I was in the corner with a book I had borrowed from Thomas's small shelf, attempting to read about the management of root vegetables and not entirely attending to it. The fire had burned down to a bed of orange coals. The light through the small window was the particular low gold of a late October afternoon. Edith worked in silence. Alaric watched her. Outside, a sheep announced itself somewhere in the distance and then thought better of whatever it had been saying. He said, after a long quiet, "You've been running this house for a long time." She looked up. "Since my mother died 7 years. "How old are you?" 24, she went back to the mending. "You?" I held very still behind the root vegetable book. 40, he said. She glanced at him. "You don't look it," she said, without any apparent flattering intent, the way she might observe that the sky had cleared or the fire needed another log. A factual assessment, delivered and done with. He seemed not to know what to do with that. Most people, when they offered Alaric Cairnholt a compliment, watched his face for the reception. Edith had gone back to her needle. "Do you mind it?" he asked after a moment. "Running everything yourself?" She considered, not the way people consider when they are composing a pleasing answer, actually considered. The needle paused, her eyes on the middle distance. "Sometimes," she said, "when it's the deep of winter and the roof leaks in the east passage and I've mended it twice already and my hands are cold. Those days I mind it a good deal." She resumed her stitching. "But mostly no, there's something satisfying in knowing what a place needs and giving it what it needs. In walking through a house at the end of the day and seeing everything in order that wasn't in order that morning." A small pause. "My mother used to say a well-run house is its own kind of quiet." He was quiet himself for a moment. "She sounds like she was a sensible woman," he said. "She was the most sensible woman I've ever known," Edith said, "which is why I've been trying to imitate her for 7 years with mixed success." There was no self-pity in it. It was said with the same directness she brought to everything, simply the truth, offered as such. "Why mixed?" he asked. "Because she was also kind in a way that never cost her anything, and I have to work at it," she said. "Some people are naturally patient. I have to remind myself every morning to be patient, and I don't always succeed, and I suspect that will be true until I die." He looked at her. She was focused on the shirt. "I don't think that's a failing," he said. "I think that's the honest version of what everyone else pretends is effortless." She looked up. Their eyes held for a moment. Then she said, "That's the most useful thing you've said in 4 days, Mr. Ashe." And I sat in my corner with the root vegetable book and thought, we are never going to leave this farm. On the 4th morning, his leg would bear weight. He tested it carefully, walking the length of the spare room and back with a measured deliberateness, and pronounced that they should leave that afternoon. He said it to me privately in the hayloft while I was collecting my things, in the flat, decided tone he used for conclusions he had already argued himself into. I recognized the tone. It was the one he used when he was making himself do something that was costing him more than he wanted to account for. I said, "Are you certain?" "No," he said, which was more honest than usual. He went to find her in the kitchen garden. I stayed near the window of the hayloft where I could see the garden gate. I am not ashamed of it. She was cutting the last of the autumn leeks, moving down the row with the easy rhythm of someone who knows their ground and their task and needs no ceremony for it. A shallow basket on her arm, the small knife working cleanly. He came through the gate and she heard him, looked up, and waited, the way she always waited, without filling the silence, without performing any particular welcome or withholding it, simply present and watching. He thanked her for the days. He did it formally, in the careful, measured way that I recognized as his version of sincerity, the version that had been shaped by too many years of not trusting warmth to survive contact with what he was and what people wanted from it. He thanked her for her time, for her father's hospitality, for the poultice, for the inconvenience she had not remarked on. She said, "I'm glad you're well, Mr. Ash." He stood in the kitchen garden. The autumn light came in at a low angle through the bare branches of the apple trees, and it lit her in a way that had nothing theatrical about it, just light on a woman holding a basket of leeks. But he stood there for a moment as though something had caught. I could see the line of his jaw from the hayloft window. I could see the slight change in his face that he would never have permitted in a room where anyone of consequence was watching. He said, "Thank you, Miss Calloway." And he left. The road north from the Calloway farm runs through 6 miles of open moorland before it hits the first town, and it is the kind of road that gives a man too much time to think and not enough scenery to distract him. I rode beside Alaric. He said nothing for the first 2 miles. I did not fill the silence. The sky had gone the pale gray of late afternoon, and the moor on either side was tawny brown in the October light, and the only sound was our horses and the distant wind. He said at the end of the 2nd mile, "I didn't tell her my name." "No," I said. "I should have before we left." "Yes." Another mile of silence. "She would have treated me differently," he said, "if she'd known." "Perhaps," I said, "or perhaps she would simply have had more information and treated you exactly the same." He considered that and did not answer. We were 3 miles from Cairnholt Hall when he said, "She told me I'd been wrong about the Harwick Bridge." "I know," I said, "I was there." "She was right," he said. "Also something I know." He was quiet for the rest of the road home, and I left him to it. The following weeks were, by any outside observation, entirely normal. Alaric returned to the business of the dukedom with the focused, tireless efficiency that was his usual register. He attended every meeting, signed every letter, made 2 additional visits to the Harwick leases that I could not account for by any practical necessity. He was methodical, present, apparently himself. I watched him more carefully than that. At dinner he was quieter than usual, which was saying something. He declined 3 invitations to houses where he would normally have gone. He spent more evenings in the library than was typical, and on the evenings I joined him, I sometimes caught him staring at nothing in particular with an expression I had not seen on him in years. Not unhappiness, not grief, but the slightly unfocused look of a man working something out. One evening I found him at the library window, looking north. The fire was low. The room smelled of old paper and the particular cold of a large stone house in November. I said, "You're thinking about her." He did not turn around. "I told you not to say things like that." "And I told you I was going to say them anyway." He turned from the window. In the firelight he looked, as I said, both older and younger than 40. "She doesn't know who I am," he said. "Then go back and tell her. And arrive at that farm as the Duke of Cairnholt." He said the title as though it were a stone he was weighing. "And watch everything change, the way she holds herself, the way she speaks, the way she decides how much to say." "You think she would change?" "Everyone changes," he said. "In the presence of a title, you know that as well as I do." I said, "I know that most people change. I am not certain she does." I thought of her crouching in the mud without hesitation. I thought of her telling him to hold still. I thought of her holding her ground over the Harwick Bridge while he deployed his most reasonable Duke voice. "Alaric, she told you that you were wrong. She made you stay in bed when you wanted to leave. She said her mother had mixed success with patience, and she did too, and she said it to a stranger. That is not a woman who is going to become a different person because she learns your surname." He was quiet for a long time. "I gave her a false name," he said. "I let her nurse me for 4 days under a false name. That is not a small thing." "No," I said, "it isn't, and I think you should go back and say exactly that, exactly what you said just now." He looked at the fire. "She may not wish to hear it." "She may not, but you'll know either way, and not knowing is doing something to you that I don't much like to watch." He was silent for another long moment. "If she says no," he said very quietly, "I will take it. I will not press. She owes me nothing." "I know that," I said. "So does she, I think." He ate his dinner that evening with more appetite than he had shown in 3 weeks, and in the morning he asked me to ride with him, and I said yes before he had finished asking. We arrived at the Calloway farm on a Tuesday morning in late October. This time we came in the Duke's formal carriage, the dark lacquered wood, the Cairnholt crest on the door, the matched pair of black horses. Because Alaric had decided in the end that arriving in any kind of concealment again would be a second deception compounded upon the first, and one was already more than he was comfortable with. He was dressed as himself, the dark tailcoat, the white cravat, the perfectly composed exterior of the most feared duke in the north. The exterior that concealed a man who was, beneath it, bracing himself with the same careful quiet he had used on the road home from the ditch. He was frightened. He would not have said so, I could tell. Thomas Calloway came to the gate when the carriage stopped on the lane, and his expression passed through several very rapid changes. The recognition of the man from his spare room, and then the carriage, and then something more complex that resolved itself very quickly into the composed dignity of a man standing on his own property who has decided that whatever has just arrived, he will meet it standing up. He bowed, correctly, with the formality a duke's carriage demanded. Alaric stepped out. He said his name, his real name, the whole of it calmly, and he watched it land. Thomas Calloway absorbed it in the manner of a man who had half suspected something without knowing quite what, and had been waiting to have it confirmed or otherwise. He said, "Your Grace." Then, after a moment, "Edith's in the house. I'll fetch her." She came to the farmhouse door. She was wearing the same plain brown dress, or one very like it, and her hair was pinned up and half escaped from the pins in exactly the way it always was, and she was wiping her hands on her apron as she came because she had been at some task and had come away from it directly, the way she did everything. Her expression was open and composed, the way it always was, ready for what the world presented. And then she saw him. I watched it cross her face. First the recognition, the man she had known, the face she had seen across the farmhouse table for 4 days. And then, a half-breath later, all the rest of it arriving at once. The carriage with the crest, her father's expression, the tailcoat, the whole weight of a title and an estate, and the impossible distance between a farmhouse kitchen and a duke's drawing room. Her hands stilled on the apron. Her eyes came to his face and stayed there. He crossed the lane. "Miss Calloway," he said, "I owe you an explanation and an apology, and I intend to give you both plainly, and then I intend to ask you something, and you are not obliged to answer quickly or at all." She waited. Not with tension. With the same quality of settled attention she brought to everything that needed to be met properly. "My name is Alaric Cairnholt," he said. "I am the Duke of Cairnholt. I gave you a false name when I arrived on your road 4 weeks ago. I gave it without thinking. It was a habit I had from writing out without my title, and I did not correct it when I should have, and I allowed 4 days to pass without telling you the truth. I am sorry for that, not as a courtesy. I am genuinely sorry." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "Why are you here?" "Because I am asking for your hand," he said. "And I want to ask it plainly, and I want you to understand something before you answer or before you decline to answer." She waited. "I did not know you when I arrived on this road," he said. "I knew nothing of you. I was a man in a ditch with a false name and a damaged leg, and you treated me like a person who needed help rather than a problem to manage. You told me to stay still when I wanted to leave. You argued with me about the Harwick Bridge, and you had the better argument every time, and you knew it, and you did not make more of it than it was." He stopped. When he went on, his voice was quieter, more careful. "I left without telling you the truth, and I have been ashamed of that since the moment we passed your gate. But what I am not ashamed of is what I found here. I found, for the first time in more years than I can honestly count, a person who spoke to me as one person speaks to another. Who disagreed with me and was right about it. Who asked nothing of me at all, and who, when I tried to thank her, said only that she was glad I was well." The lane was very quiet. Thomas Calloway had moved some distance away, and was examining the horizon with the firm intentionality of a man who is giving 2 people the privacy they need, and would like credit for the restraint. "I came back," Alaric said, "because I did not want to spend the rest of my life as the man who left that farmhouse without saying what he meant. And what he meant was this." He paused. "I am asking for the chance to be known, not as the Duke, but as the man who would have stayed in your spare room another week if his leg had allowed it, simply to sit at the fire and hear you talk." A breath. "I am asking you to consider whether you would be willing to know me as I tried to know you, before either of us had a title or a false name between us. And if you find, when you do know me, that the answer is no, I will take it without argument. But I could not stay away, and I could not return as anyone but myself." Edith Calloway looked at him for a long moment. Her expression had not changed precisely, but something in it had settled, as though something that had been moving had come to rest. She said, "You argued the wrong side of the Harwick Bridge question because you were working from incomplete information. When I gave you the complete information, you changed your position." "Yes," he said. "That is a more useful quality than being right the first time," she said. A very small silence. "I will consider it," she said. There was more. There were the weeks of formal visits and the slower accumulation of actual knowledge, his name known to her now, her father's opinion of him sought and given, the long, careful work of two people coming to understand each other in the proper order, with every card on the table. I was present for some of those visits and absent for others. I know that he told her about his first wife, not in detail, but honestly enough that she knew the shape of it. I know that she told him about the 7 years of the house and the East Passage roof and the 2 hard winters. I know they argued twice more about county matters, and that she won one and he won one, and that he took considerable satisfaction in the one he won and even more in the one he lost. I know that by November she had stopped wiping her hands on her apron before she spoke to him, which I took as a sign that she had stopped thinking of him as a formal occasion. They were married in February, in the small chapel at Cairnholt, on a morning with frost on the grass and a pale, cold light. The ceremony was small because Alaric had asked for it to be, and the guest list was short because he cared about length of list not at all. Thomas Calloway sat in the front pew in a coat that was clearly his best one, and he sat in it with the straightforward pride of a man who raised a daughter he is proud of and feels no need to pretend otherwise. I stood beside Alaric as his groomsman. I had been his second at a duel at 22, his witness at the worst days of his first marriage, and his interlocutor through everything the years between had contained. I had never stood beside him as easy as I stood beside him that morning. Edith walked in on her father's arm in a gown of pale gray, not white. She was a practical woman, she had said, and she intended to wear it again. She walked the length of the chapel with the same steady, unhurried pace she brought to everything. No hesitation, no performance, no self-consciousness about being watched. She simply came down the aisle the way she came through the kitchen garden gate, as though she had somewhere to be and was going there. When she reached him, she looked at him, and he looked at her, and I saw on his face, this face I had known for 23 years, this face that had learned so many ways to be composed and careful and sufficient unto itself, the full, uncomplicated expression of a man who knows exactly where he is and is glad to be there. The vicar said the words, they said the words back. Afterwards, at the small wedding breakfast, I found myself beside Thomas Calloway. He was eating a piece of raised pie, with the composed satisfaction of a man whose long and considered estimate of the way things ought to go has been confirmed. I said, "Were you surprised when the carriage came?" He thought about it. "I knew something was off about the man," he said, "from the first day, too quiet about himself, too much assurance in the way he held himself, with no cause for it that I could see, since he was lying in my spare room in a borrowed shirt." He took another bite of pie. "I'd have asked sooner, but Edith told me to leave it." I said, "She told you?" "She said she'd work it out herself," he said, without particular surprise, as though this was simply the normal way his daughter handled uncertainty. "She told me afterwards that she had decided on the second morning." "Decided what?" I asked. "Not who he was," Thomas said, "just that he was worth deciding about. She said he was the kind of man who listened when he was wrong." He finished the pie. In her experience, that was rarer than most people admitted. He said it without sentimentality, simply as an observation about his daughter's judgment, which had never, he implied, failed him yet. I nodded, and we stood together for a moment in the pleasant quiet of a thing well done, while across the room Alaric Cairnholt, the most feared duke in the north, a man who had spent 40 years learning not to want anything, leaned down to hear something his new wife was saying to him and laughed. A real laugh with nothing held back in it, the kind that does not consult propriety before it arrives. I have told this story only once before. But the pleasure of a story told by a friend who loves you is not the information. It is the witness. And I was there,